Good morning, my name's Jessica and I'm here today to talk about how we can give effective feedback in distance learning. So hopefully by the end of this session, we will have reflected on distance learning, sort of where we are so far, what we've achieved and what some of the challenges are. We will be looking at what the research suggests is good feedback as a bit of a reminder. And then we'll be looking at different methods that you can try with distance learning to try and make that feedback really effective. So let's start off on a bit of a positive note here. At the start of 2020, a lot of us had not really used much distance learning. We weren't experts. We have upskilled. So I know that many of us have been using Microsoft Teams, recording lessons and doing live lessons. We've got much better at sharing our resources by putting them on online portals and to set work via platforms like Show My Homework or Class Charts, or just by having that greater communication via email. So on a real positive note here, we have upskilled as a cohort of teachers. We have learnt a lot in the last few months. So that brings us really to what are the challenges of distance learning, and when it comes specifically to feedback, because that's one area that we need to work on. Whereas now we might have mastered how we get our content to our kids and that they are engaging with it, we now need to make sure that we're not just giving them the lessons, that they're actually learning from it and that they're able to make good progress from it. So how can we have that effective feedback that we would normally do in a lesson? How can we make it as effective in a distance learning situation? So there are some real problems and difficulties that we need to think about to overcome. So the first is, generally in lessons, there is a lot of student interaction. There's a lot of conversation, there's interaction with the teachers. Students are able to give peer feedback, share ideas, and obviously as a teacher, we can question them and help guide their ideas. Without that, how do we do that outside of a classroom setting, particularly when they haven't maybe got as many people to bounce ideas off? Another problem of feedback, a common problem in the past, which led to the assessment without levels being introduced, was that students, when they were given back a piece of work, would focus on the grade that they were given. So if we had students who were getting an A, some of those students would be like, brilliant, I've got an A, I don't need to do anything, I'm very happy with it, I don't need to improve my work. At the same time, we might have got students who were getting Fs, who were really disheartened and begin to think, there's no point in me doing this feedback because I've already failed. So that idea that if we are just looking at what students are sending us, putting a grade on it and sending that back, we don't want to fall into that trap again where students aren't engaging with the work and aren't engaging with that feedback. The final big problem with distance learning is that sometimes you lose that personal touch, that personal relationship that we build over time in the classroom. We get to know our students really well, we can read their facial expressions, we know when they're upset or when they come in and they're having a bad day, and we can deal with that, and very often we are absolute experts at turning it around and getting them engaged in lessons. So it's a difficult one when we don't have that relationship. If they get some negative feedback or feedback that isn't all praise, if we're asking them to do something, some students might not respond very well to that. So how do we build that positive relationship? To back that up, Zumbrun and colleagues did some research in 2016, and they found that 20% of students disregarded the feedback they were given on their work purely down to having a poor relationship with their teacher. So again, it shows just how important it is for us to have a really strong relationship and build that. If we go into another lockdown, if we have to do a long period of remote learning, how are we going to be able to do that? Similarly, thinking about the need for students to act on feedback and actually do something about it, Hendrick and McPherson pointed out that students will only really act on feedback if they believe that they can get better. So actually having the motivation behind that is so important. So it's building that growth mindset attitude. Okay, so if we just go back to real basics before we start looking at distance learning, let's just go back to different types of feedback. And I'm sure I'm probably teaching you all how to suck eggs. This is probably all what you did on your PGCs, but it's always good to go back and have a little reminder. So there are main two types of feedback. The first is formative. So formative assessment is that which is normally happening when learning is taking place. It's commonly known as assessment for learning, or AFL. And the main thing with AFL when it's taking place is that students and teachers respond to it. So students might find that they've got an area of weakness and they need to learn and improve on, but teachers need to plan for activities that are going to help that student to make progress on the back of that. Summative assessment generally happens at the end of a period of learning as a measure of progress. So we might have a scheme of work and we might do a summative assessment at the end in which we can grade and sort of say, this is what you've achieved. So a good way of thinking about it is that formative assessment is sort of on each of these stepping stones, you might be giving them feedback on how to get to the next one, how to get to the next one. Our summative assessment would be, what stepping stone have they got to? All right, so it would be that wherever you manage to get to sort of feedback. So thinking about that with formative and summative feedback, a big, huge moment, and again, I imagine a lot of you already know this, came with Dylan William and Paul Black's really groundbreaking article called Inside the Black Box. And it highlighted how important AFL was, how important it was that we don't just kind of give them a grade and leave them to it, that we actually as teachers have a responsibility to help them move forward. So here are two quotes from that. So teachers need to know about their pupils' progress and difficulties with learning so that they can adapt their own work to meet their needs. Similarly, William more recently said, good teaching starts from where the learner is rather than where we would like her or him to be. So really we need that formative assessment to always know where our students are, what do they need to do next. So before we have a look at distance learning, I'd just like you to pause the video now, maybe take a moment to think, what formative assessment do you normally do in a classroom setting? So not in a distance learning setting, but what kind of formative assessment would you do day to day? At the same time, with summative assessment, how would you use that normally? Is it a case that you do an assessment and you just record the mark, or are you doing something else with that that is maybe a little bit more useful? So pause the video here and I'll give you a few seconds to think about that. Okay, hopefully you came up with a few ideas. I'm sure you've done lots, but here are a few just that you might do regularly in your lesson. So some of these bottom ones like clickers and Caboodle are the online interactive things that we might see. Normally when we're giving that formative feedback in our lessons, or we're doing whole class feedback like that, we as teachers would respond pretty much straight away with feedback. Summative assessments might be done more in the form of knowledge test or a written assessment or exams, but again, we would normally give quite extensive written feedback on that. And normally on that summative assessment, we would expect a response. So whether that's doing like green pen responding or dirt work, different schools have different names for it, but we'd expect them to respond to it with feedback, which we would be able to oversee and monitor in a classroom situation. So now we've got to start thinking about what does good feedback look like generally then, so both formative and summative assessment. So going back to Dylan William, he said that he wished he'd never called assessment for learning AFL. He hates that phrase now because he's found that actually a lot of teachers have started to use AFL as summative assessment, that they've started to focus more on data collection rather than using it to inform their own practice. Instead, he said he wished he'd call it responsive teaching. So that's a really good way to think about feedback, that everything that we are doing when we're doing assessment is assessing where they are and then responding with feedback, giving advice on how to move forward. Brookhart also talked about that good feedback should be just in time, so it should be fresh in their students' memory, and just for me information, so personalised, individualised feedback. Another good example of effective feedback here was that we point out praise. So we say what a student has done well. We probe, what could you do better? We've got an action step, you need to try doing this. You need to practice it, so actually do it. Plan for how you could do this better next time and follow up. All right, so a teacher might go back and follow up. Another way to think about that might be, where am I now? What have I done well? What do I need to do? How will I find how to move on, and where will I go next? So planning for your next steps. Another good thing about good feedback is having that good teacher and student balance. So cognitive load should really be on the student. They should be working harder than you. There's nothing more disheartening than when you have written, half a page of feedback and then you get a one-word response. So make sure that the activities that you're giving them are actually making them do the harder work. Okay, so now that we know what good feedback looks like, just a bit of a quick reminder, I've hopefully got a few ideas here for you to go away and try in your distance learning settings. So I've divided it into formative feedback and summative feedback, and things for you to maybe go away and try. So the first one really is to use that chat section. We don't have the option necessarily of having that question in like we normally would in a classroom setting, or being able to walk around and see how students are going on. But we do have the chat setting in Teams where we can ask students to respond to a question. We might ask them to type an answer in there. As those answers are coming in, we can verbally respond to it as we're reading it on the chat there. That's really useful, I've found, for when we've been looking at exam questions. So maybe on here is an exemplar answer. I put, what mark would you give it? And then in the chat, I might expect students to give it a mark and explain it. As they're doing it, I can say, yes, I agree with that because, or maybe I think you've been a bit too generous there because if you look, they haven't done this, that, or the other. Okay, another thing to try is to try and build oracy skills in, and that's really difficult because I'm a real big believer that oracy improves attainment and allows students to make progress. And that relies purely on them having a conversation with each other and listening to each other's ideas and building that so they can form their own argument. So how on earth do we build oracy skills if they're not even in the same room? So one thing to do is to set learning tasks that require interaction between students. So when we're setting work, that actually we're not asking them just to go away and do a task on their own, that maybe we need them to interact with each other. And that way they can actually get feedback off each other. That takes all the pressure off us as well. We can watch it and see what's happening and step in and give advice. But obviously they're doing the feedback for each other. So a really good way of doing that is by using the breakout options in Teams. We're going to have a go at that ourselves later on. So if you've not done that before, you can see it on there, but it's very easy to set up different groups within a teaching group that you have. You can ask them all, set them different questions, or say you're in group 1, you're in group 2. I'd like you to go into the breakout group for 5 minutes and I would like you to discuss this question. You can then give them structured sentences, you can give them guidelines for how they should do this, so no silly behaviour or anything like that. But that can really mean that they're pushing each other and giving feedback on their own work. So things like the 2 examples on the bottom there work really, really well for them to give their own feedback there. Okay, another good way of using some formative assessment might be to give them an exit slip. So here's one that I might have given out physically, but you can put this on a PowerPoint and you could ask them to maybe just rate themselves with a number in the chat or to email you, however it is that they tell you what number it is they need to grade themselves. So after a lesson, they might say, I'm still not sure about this, I'm a grade 1, I need a bit more help. Or they might say, I'm real pro at this, I really, really know what I'm doing, I feel confident enough to teach other people with it. So once you have that information at the end of the lesson, you as a teacher would need to respond to that and plan how you can feed back in your next session with that. So it might be that if you have a live lesson and you can set up some breakout groups, you might utilize yourself and you might utilize some of your students. So maybe you could have a breakout group where you have the 4s, people who feel like they're real pros, working with the 2s. They're sort of there, they just need a bit of guidance and a bit of help. And that would free you up to then have a much smaller feedback session with maybe the number 1s, the ones who really need the help. And you could set the 3s a whole different task entirely to be getting on with something new, to maybe practice it in a different setting. So that would allow you to kind of personalize the feedback and actually utilize each other and get a bit of peer feedback in there as well. Okay, just thinking about recorded lessons here. I know a lot of live lessons as well are also being recorded for students who might not be able to access it at that time, but some things to think about really. One is using the pause button. So I've put a pause button on here and it's, I've already used it earlier on, haven't I? But what you can do is just encourage people to stop the video and have a think for a moment and rewind and watch videos again. So one thing to try is virtual retellings. So if you have given your students a lesson on some content, maybe you've just told them how positive and negative numbers work when you're multiplying and dividing. And then what you might ask them to do is actually to record themselves re-explaining that. What they might have to do with that is watch your video several times, and that maybe gives them a bit more focus and a bit more engagement because they've really got to listen carefully. So that works very well. The other thing with that is by pausing it, we're actually lightening the cognitive load. Some of our students might feel really uncomfortable with the idea of trying to listen and trying to write and plow through things, and there's a time constraint in a live lesson. A recorded lesson might just give them the freedom and confidence to take that little bit longer. They're not as worried, they can concentrate more on what they're doing. Another thing to think about on your recorded lessons might be to ask the students for feedback on your lessons. Is there anything that you could do to improve yourself? Okay, the next thing on here is just focusing a little bit more on summative assessment. But remember, summative assessment, you might be actually trying to find out what have they learned so far and give them a grade, but that can still be formative. What are you going to do with that information next? Is there a certain group that has underperformed, or is there something you might learn and need to revisit in a later topic? That's quite useful information. So one really good way of using summative information is maybe using Microsoft Forms for surveys and for knowledge tests. So here is one I made earlier, as it was. It's multiple choice, it self-marks. So I've already told it which ones are the correct answers, and students can quickly check whether they've got it right. It gives them immediate feedback. And I get a sheet that looks like this that shows me exactly how many of my students got it right or wrong. And that might highlight for me areas that I need to go back over and let them correct any mistakes that they may have made. Another one on there might be live marking. So if your students have actually submitted you a summative piece of work, so maybe an end of term assessment, and you're going to mark it, it might actually be really, really useful for you to share your screen in a lesson, and you can talk through how you're marking it. So obviously you can take out off the names, you can add comments to it, but it means that students will get far more used to what you're looking for because you can talk through that process. Another one can be interactive videos. So if you've given feedback on several different pieces of work, you might ask them to then go away and do a task to correct it. But rather than just giving them a little bit of a vague, you need to add some more information on why William won the Battle of Hastings, for example, you're going to actually instead give them a QR code that is a link for you talking about specifically about that topic. So I might, if I was doing a lesson on the Battle of Hastings, I might have one QR code that's asking them to talk more about Harold Godwinson's failings and another video that's focusing more on William's tactics. So we can direct them specifically to recorded videos for their feedback. Another really cool thing to do is asking your students to try live marking or collaboration, which you can oversee. So this isn't you doing it, you're doing the setup, but actually you're watching your students give each other feedback and you can step in at any point. So this is really easy to do, really easy to set up. All you need to do is open a Word document and click on the, if you do this through the Office application, Office 365, click on the three little dots, open up a Word document, you make a new document, you click share in the top right. You can then share that with your organisation and copy the link. Send out the link, however you would do that, email or on Share My Homework. I would then create a document with a task that I would like them to do. So here's an A-level essay that I would like them to argue about. I've given them some instructions on what it is they need to do and some guidelines on appropriate behaviour. You can also differentiate this. So you might ask some students to be in charge of spelling and grammar, or you might give some students the job of challenging what other people are writing specifically. So they're not actually adding any new content themselves, they're just challenging what has already been written. So how that ends up looking is something like this. So you can see on here a couple of videos where actually students are working on the same document at the same time. This is slightly speeded up. So what they can do is see what other people are writing. They don't have to be in the same place to do that. They can be at different houses. And as you can see on this one a little bit more clearly, the different colours are different people writing. It's quite useful sometimes to have them doing it in different coloured fonts so you can follow that. But it's very interesting to watch that unfold whilst you're sat at home. Okay, there's some nice practical ideas for you to try. One thing that we're going to have a look at in a minute is the breakout groups. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to actually have a look at these 5 strategies that Dylan William puts forward as being really good practice for responsive teaching. And you can find this in his book here, so Embedded Formative Assessment. Now, these have obviously been written in mind with a normal classroom setting, not distance learning, not COVID-19. But I would like you to go into breakout groups in a second, and I would like you to have a think about, are there any of these methods that we could use to make sure that we are getting responsive teaching and effective feedback into our distance learning lessons? So hopefully you're all in different groups. I'm imagining I've given you all a number 1 to 5. And I'd like you to go into your breakout group in Teams, and I would like you to read the number that you are on here. And I would like you to discuss for 5 minutes what techniques might work for you. So if you come back in 5 minutes, that would be brilliant. I'll see you in a minute when you're back. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to chat through some of those ideas about what might work and what might not. And hopefully maybe you found some ideas there that would be really useful for you to try. I'd be really interested to know your feedback on that, and being able to kind of jump in and out of these different groups has been really useful. For those people who haven't used breakout groups before, it's worth me just sharing this for you. As you can see, we have a general group here for distance learning and effective feedback. I set up 5 groups beforehand and asked you all to go in there. I can jump in between all these groups. I can record all these groups at the same time. I can see all the different chats that are going on in those different groups. So this is just a really good example of how this might work for a class of students. So very, very effective tool to use for those smaller discussions. So I hope you found lots of these ideas really useful today, but there is a lot of further reading that you could do on here. So I've just put up some links here to some of the people I've referenced. Some of the ideas I've used today have come from John Hattie's Distance Learning Playbook, and these are the places I found really useful. They have really useful sections for assessment and feedback. So thank you all very much for watching, and I look forward to hearing from you soon.